Hi there, my name is DaCosta. I'm a councillor in Windsor and Maidenhead. My background is that I came to England when I was 5. So I was born in Nairobi in Kenya. My parents were from a place called Goa in India, which used to be a Portuguese colony. And I came to England when I was 5 and we ended up in Slough. And that's where I grew up, spent most of my life growing up. Went to university to do biochemistry and that sort of stuff, then off to start a professional career doing accounting, first in Ireland and then back in the UK. It's funny, I grew up on all those sort of, for many of you, you won't have a clue who I'm about to say, but many of the old black and white films, the David Niven films and the wartime films. So I very much model myself on being a proper English gentleman and with all the sort of the plus sides that came from that. But of course, that also meant I didn't see the negative side at all, you know. So I settled down, married, had a few kids, carried on my profession as an accountant with a large Franco-Belgian company, and then became redundant in about 2000, just after 2000, and switched into teaching. I spent 5 years teaching, and I tell you, you need horses for courses there. I will never have a bad word said about teaching. So after 5 years teaching, that was enough for me. And although I love teaching, it's hard work. It's grueling. And then moved into sort of running my own sort of business as an accountant and dealing with tax and stuff like that. But at the same time, I've always been sort of very passionate about helping people. I love people, helping people. So in all stages of my life. So one of the things I started to do was help in the local community. I ended up, to cut a long story short, rather than just helping out, I actually ended up being a councillor here in Windsor and Maidenhead. Now, Windsor's a beautiful, beautiful area, and it's a very white area. So it is unusual, quite the contrast to Slough, which is just across the river, which even from today's COVID stats, and Slough's in tier 3, we're in tier 2. And so that sort of began my sort of helping out people in a new way, which was as a representative of them. So I'm an independent. I don't follow any political party. I don't have to toe the line with any political party. I can actually say what people want me to say, represent them where they need representing, and have an independent voice and not have to worry about towing the line, as I said earlier on. So that's sort of where it started. In Windsor and Maidenhead, we have as many issues as we do anywhere else in the country, although it's a very leafy area and borough. Nevertheless, it's got its own real issues, which I won't talk about entirely right now. So that's sort of my background. That's where I am at the moment. And two of the things I've been working on over the last couple of years as well have been, one is climate change. Climate change is something I only came to about 1.5 years ago after some of the public demonstrations. I knew nothing about climate change. And it's like many of the issues that have happened to us, like food banks, it's like, why did I not know about this? How did I not realize? How did this grow up under my feet for a decade or 2 decades and me not realize? But of course, judging by the color of my skin, having grown up here, the one thing I do know a little bit about, or I can't say I know about it, I've experienced it, is clearly racism. And that's the sort of latest project, is really to say project, but it's more of a mission, really. It's something I feel very moved by in terms of in my conscience, that is something that we need to do something about, even though it doesn't necessarily directly affect me, but we have to get things right for our next generations. You ask, what's my personal experience of racism? And when did I feel or become aware of it, or was that just how it is? It's strange that I completely bought into the UK and adopted the culture. So it's a bit of a mixed bag at times. Yes, when I was probably a 5-year-old child, I remember picking up the telephone in the middle of the night and having somebody say, "We're coming to get you. Pack your bags. We're sending you home straight away." And I didn't necessarily understand what that was, but I was clearly disturbed by that telephone call. And then you go on to the fact that actually I became part of the school system, first in my family to go to university and all those sorts of things. Had a great time at university, all within sort of constraints. I think you're sort of partly aware of the constraints, but because you still, life goes on, you make the most of what you are and where you're at. So I think that's kind of like a tough question, because I sort of ignored part of it. I think there's 2 issues in terms of racism, in my mind, my experience. One is the explicit racism, and yes, it is hurtful, and it's easy to deal with, though. I mean, it's a challenge. You can challenge it, you can walk away from it, and generally speaking, you sort of try and keep away from those situations. But they are easy to deal with. You can block them, say, recognize them, and move away from them, and do something about them. I think the hidden racism is much more difficult because not only do you not see it, but you don't know what you're missing. You don't know what you've missed out on. All you can point to is, why have I got so many job rejections? Why don't people even want to interview me? Why don't I get the job if I go up for it? So you don't know what you've been excluded from. If you go to buy a house, sometimes it's overt, or it used to be overt. Now it's not overt. People will or won't sell to you. But things are so much better now, in 2020 than they were in the 1960s and 70s. So you make the most of what you can, but on merit, could I have been a senior executive in a company? Could I have had a career as a pilot in the RAF? I'll never really know the answer to those questions. But clearly we recognise that there are issues, so we want to do something about it to make things better for future generations. As somebody who's grown up in this country, so I look up to the authorities, and so I've really normalised some of that behaviour. You sort of get on with it. And I'm very much a sort of get on and do what you can. So I will carry on and do what I can. I think much of the racism I thought had gone, but it wasn't until I came into council that I began to realise that actually some of these attitudes are still there amongst people. It's expression said in jest. Sort of go back to where you come from, or seeing other people patting an Asian councillor on his head, and you're thinking that is so disrespectful in the culture. So you see these things happening there. I think for my wife, it's interesting that she realised what was going on with issues, because I would just said, well, okay, well, whatever, it happens, I ignore it. So she started to notice it much more. And when she gets hurt, that's when I sort of step in and say, okay, I need to do something here, because it's not fair that she should get hurt. But interestingly, the racism goes both ways, because I think she's experienced racism when we go out in areas where there are certainly ethnic minorities, and so they also will look down on a mixed race couple, saying that they would have a really inappropriate how to put it opinion of a white lady, so judge her based on the color of her skin and the fact that she's with someone who's not white, and that's just completely wrong. Not taking the time to get to know her. But I think when we talk about behaviour and languages and expectations, those are fantastic sort of points that have been raised and sort of come to the crux of the matter. Those are sort of like the smoking guns of the language, the behaviour, the cultural paradigms which permit racism. And that's what I've sort of come to realise just through this whole process now. So I suppose the question is, what are the tangible evidence that point to hidden racism, or things that reduce equality to a colour rather than to the personality? I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that we have to find out what those smoking guns are, what the evidence and the languages are, because once we've identified them, we can use them as an analysis tool to go through organisations, through councils, and say, okay, look, okay, we can see we've got institutional racism happening here. So what can we do now to bring people on side to eradicate racism? I think the other aspect is that I think it's an education. As an education, we can't sort of take entrenched views and so try and criticise the the sort of cancel culture, saying that you're wrong, bash, bash, bash. I want my rights enforced. I think it has to be very much a collaborative thing, that we have to work together to bring people on side, because after all, isn't that demonstrating humanity? That's another great question, is that, what about the research? Why did I get there, and how did I get there? Well, actually, because I've been representing people locally, I've sort of taken that up with a passion. And to me, it's really been a case of, well, how do you represent people effectively? How do you give them an equal say in society? If you like, Alexis Tsipras, who was the former Prime Minister of Greece, he used the expression deeper democracy. So how do you deepen democracy? Right now in England, it seems very, very shallow. So so how do you give everyone a say, a right, an ability to influence decisions? So that's where I came from, is really to try and give people that influence, because here in Windsor and Maidenhead, we used to have a very, very conservative council, very conservative in the sense that they controlled it. In other areas in the country could be very Lib Dem council, who control everything. And so effectively opposition, or not dissenting voices, but constructively criticising voices, are silenced. In other places, it could be the Labour Party. So it's not about about the nature or the political colour of the party, but rather that issue of total control. So what became quite clear is that when you look at the way in which the system is designed and the way it works, the political system of casting a vote, of having an election, it seems really clear to me that democracy doesn't end at the ballot box, but democracy begins with your vote and continues with your involvement. And I want to say this twice. So your involvement, your presence is your power. So your involvement in the process is your presence, and that's your power in the process. If you don't get involved politically, you know, what I've seen is that self-interested people, and we all know when I'm talking about career politicians, they will take control and take power and use it for their own purposes, what's in their minds, because if you don't tell them, they don't know. So really important, your involvement, you know, is your presence, and that's your power. But that's what we have today. We have a system where it's very, very shallow. People cast their votes once every 4 years or once every 5 years. And what happens is that the election promises are ignored and new things are brought in, which, hey, I didn't vote for that. I didn't ask you to take us in that direction. So it's pretty poor, really. It's a very shallow democracy. So that's where I came from, is trying to say, look, actually, how do we deepen democracy? How do we give everybody a say? And I didn't even think about colour at that point in time. It was just about people. So I did some analysis. As some of the analysis was looking at the statistical data, the demographic data, so with the ONS, Official National Statistics, and the census data. So great, let's compare for each area the ethnic complexion with the complexion of the councillors in council, the people who are having some level of decision making or influence over what goes on in your life. And I was a bit surprised because and because I was surprised by the results, I did the analysis across all of the surrounding councils. I thought, well, you know, maybe Windsor and Maidenhead was a bit of an aberration, but it really wasn't. Then what we found is that whites are slightly underrepresented in council. Asians are definitely overrepresented in council. But what really stuck out like a sore thumb was that blacks are almost absent from positions of influence, you know, as councillors. And I was really taken aback by that, because it was fairly clear that that's the same across the board. Clearly there were black councillors in the areas where there are high ethnic black populations, but not as many as the population you know, data might suggest there should be. So what also surprised me is that when George Floyd died, or was killed, I should say, this whole concept of Black Lives Matter came up again, and I thought, well, let me review that research. What I actually found was that it's getting worse. So there are less black people now, percentage-wise, involved in politics or in positions of councillors than there were 5 or 6 years ago. And that really shocked me. And I think it's a matter of conscience. I thought, well, I better step up and do something about this now. So what happened was that one of the local councillors decided to put together a motion which mentioned Black Lives Matter, but it was nothing to do with the equality, the fight for equality, the fight against racism. So I challenged them, and to their credit, they said, great, let's get together and create a motion which will reflect what really we need to do. Let me tell you a little bit about the motion. I mean, the motion really looks to address what we consider to be some of the issues, bringing some practical insight, some practical action that will deliver positive results. Doreen Lawrence, Baroness Doreen Lawrence, who's the mother of the late Stephen Lawrence, on the same day that the motion was presented, she actually published a report called A Missed Opportunity. And it's very interesting because many of the issues she talks about, the outcomes she's asking for, have been coincidentally reflected in some way in the outcomes we've asked for in the motion. So I think for me, what we need to look at is, I think first is find ways of identifying identifying institutional racism. And then obviously the next aspect of that is, once you've identified it, is that you need to find ways of systematically dismantling institutional racism. It's going to take time. It's going to be an effort, because it's a mindset, it's a way of thinking, it's a whole worldview which we've got to dismantle. So those are the first things, if you like, relating to stats and what do we do then. The next aspect, I think, is to do with education. And I don't just mean schools, it also has to be adults, because I've gone through all my life not really knowing about slavery, not really knowing about the millions of people who have died as a result of Britain's colonial past. That's not to say that Britain didn't do some fantastic things. Oh, yes, it did. But it also did some awful things. And I think without that balance of recognizing the good and the bad, how can you constructively criticize an organization or move forward into the future if what you're doing is actually building on top of, you know, lives lost in the past, which, so I think we have to acknowledge these things and help people. So I suppose what we could ask for is actually, if you've got great lesson plans out there for Key Stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if you've got, then please come and share them with us, and let's find ways of talking about this to say, well, actually, what actually works, what actually changes people's mindsets, what helps people think and challenge what's in themselves, and come to a conclusion which they've reasoned rather than they've just absorbed. That's one thing. And the same thing happens with adults. As I said, I've grown up in this country, I didn't know anything about it. So is there a program of education, again, lesson plans which help us learn things, or assets or resources or videos or even installations, artworks, which will help people come to terms with what's happened, reconcile them to it, almost like a process of grief. We've lost something, we have to reconcile it, we have to then move forward into the future. But until we address it, it's there as lurking, you know, in the background. And then I think for us locally, we have to celebrate belatedly the achievements of people of colour and recognise that, you know what, these guys really helped our country. They really helped us be who we are, what we are, and in the place we are in the world. So, you know, well done, applause to them, that recognition. And then finally, it's a talk. I think we all have to talk, all parties, and so we don't have entrenched positions on one side or on the other, throwing brickbats at each other. That's not constructive. I think as we go into the future, we've got greater issues to deal with, and we have to work together. You know, we've got some crazy survival issues, destruction of our ecosystems, existential threats, flooding, COVID, an increasing number of pandemics are reported or expected. So we have to work together to face these difficulties. So let's put these things, get these things right now, and then move forward together. And both the education aspect and recognizing what went wrong in the past, recognizing what we did wrong in the past, and also the issue of changing for the future. George Monbiot, he writes some great stuff, especially on cultural racism, but also on climate change. So he actually put out a great video which pointed at the narrative which was created. And this narrative, this storyline still exists in our mindsets, in the way we think about people. So this was the mindset. So this was the narrative that the British, I say in this case the British, because I'm in Britain, I am British, this is the country I'm trying to make better. So this was the narrative. The narrative was this, that we wanted to go out there and exploit other countries. Well, the only way you can exploit another country is by belittling the people of those countries, calling them savages, calling them backward, saying that, you know, talking about them not being able to eat with knives and forks. So if you create this narrative, you then are able to justify the atrocities and the pillaging of that country. But the trouble with that narrative is that it still exists in our society today. Britain was great because but you have to complete that narrative and say, yes, we did, but we also did this, this, and this. These were ordinary, normal people with a different culture. So I think they come together with, sort of exposing that narrative and say, okay, now we have to unwind our history to take that narrative out of our history, so that that narrative, that way of thinking doesn't exist or is not allowed to continue to exist today. So I think they both come together in that. I would say, come and talk to me. We passed the motion, which is great. It wasn't without opposition, which was sad, but true. And it sort of just hints at the underlying issues that are still exist. But come and help me, come and talk to me. Let's talk together. Let's see what we can do. If I can help you, you can help me. Let's stimulate each other to sort of go in different directions and do the things we can see. So I need help from people, black people, white people, it doesn't matter. or who can identify institutional racism. If you're an expert at identifying institutional racism, come and talk to me, because I can go back to our council and say, great, this is what you need to be looking for. These are the stats, these are the figures. Once they know, I can get them to say, well, let's report on this once a year, and we'll review that once a year and see how we're doing. So we don't just want the straightforward ethnic breakdown of our workforce. That's not going to give us entirely the right answers. So it's just whatever stats people know about, come and talk to me. And then another group of people will know how they've experienced racism and have also experienced winding it out, ironing it out of a system. So come and talk to us again. We're looking to hold a conference here in Windsor and Maidenhead, possibly in a year's time, to say, look, let's come together, let's talk about these issues, let's share best practice, let's share what's worked for us. So again, contact me and we'll get something going there. I think I hinted at earlier on, lesson plans for different key stages. That would be great if you've already got lesson plans, which you think would be effective in helping people understand the dilemmas that people faced back then that we would not do now, and then how would you do things differently. And also courses and exhibits for adults. That would also be something else that we want to sort of facilitate here through our library services, through our museum services. And we might need help with some of the research, because one of the really interesting things is that when I went to do some research on slavery, it's really hard because nobody has ever kept concise information on slavery. There's a bit of information in Bristol, a bit of information here, a bit of information there. So to find out how many slaves, how many black people were actually enslaved and what effect that has had, it's virtually impossible. Someone has to go and do that. But what I can say is that when we look at when slavery was abolished, people were paid reparations, compensation for the fact that their black slaves were freed. In today's money, how much do you think that would come to, the amount of money that was paid back in the 19th century to people who were slave owners in the UK? Ordinary people, members of parliament, middle-class people and industrialists. It was nearly £20 billion. Huge amounts of money. And that shows the extent of the problem. It was huge. And so that means thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were deeply affected for generations. So these are the sorts of facts that you kind of try and have to poke out, glean out. So again, so there are facts and figures. Come and talk to us. Let's put it together, or I'll help you put stuff together if you want to be the repository. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, what can we do to help political parties make progress on this, both internally and recognizing things externally? I think I'd put that down to you people and say what I said at the beginning. You know, your presence is your power. Your presence is your voice. So you need to be involved in the political parties. Go and join them en masse. You know, go in there, go join their meetings, go to their weekly meetings, their monthly meetings, and start talking about these things. I think the young people in society also, I say to you, you are the answer to our future and to correct our past. I'm sorry to say that you have to clean up our mess. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying you've got a new way of working together. You've been learning about collaboration, about working across the country, across countries to bring together solutions. So you need to go into these parties and change them, change their culture, change their ethics, change the way they look at things. So I probably say, actually, the answer is you. Right, so if I was to summarize, I'd say, you know, the fight for justice, and we are talking about justice, it's not just equality, this is justice. The fight for justice really goes on from one generation to another. And last generation, it was people like Martin Luther King. This generation, it's you and me. We're the ones who have to fight for justice now. And you can help me, and I can help you, absolutely. And if there's stuff that you think you can help me, as I said, the key issues for me are really, how do I identify institutional racism? How do we deal with it thereafter? How do we take it out of the system? How do we change people's mindsets so they see that, have that light bulb moment? What are good education resources which help children, but not just children, but also people of my age, oldies, who need to be retrained, who need to have our thought processes examined or looked at by ourselves. So what are the good resources that we can put in place? And if you've got experience of these issues, you know, come and talk to me. If you want to come and speak at our conference in a year or so's time, then again, please contact me. Thank you.